Fortune teller's Karmic Retribution, a family's tragic loss. In a village plagued by superstition and hardship, the tragic story of a father and son unfolds, where fate, the river, and an unscrupulous fortune teller conspire to bring about unimaginable grief. The father, Ben, a former soldier still suffering the physical and emotional scars of war, attempts to save a man caught in the river's deadly currents. His teenage son, Oliver, a bright and skilled swimmer, dives in to help. But the river's wrath consumes Oliver, leaving his father and mother, Sarah, in despair. Superstition takes hold of the villagers, as they believe Oliver's death was caused by the vengeful river spirit, and the local fortune teller, known as Master Cole, exploits their fears. As Ben and Sarah struggle with their loss, Master Cole convinces them that their son's spirit is restless and only an expensive ritual can save them from a curse. Desperate and vulnerable, the grieving parents agree, but their nightmare is far from over. Oliver's spirit returns, not to torment them, but to warn them about the deception they've fallen into. The chilling conclusion sees the once respected Master Cole lose his mind, haunted by the very spirits he claimed to control, as the family's tragic fate reverberates through the village. Part 1. The peaceful village of Thornton. In the heart of a misty valley, nestled beside the winding river of Thornton, lay a village that time seemed to have forgotten. Thornton, with its cobblestone streets and weathered cottages, was a place untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Here the river was both a lifeline and a curse, winding through the center of the village like a dark, silent observer of all that transpired. For centuries, the villagers had lived by its banks, their lives shaped by its rhythms and moods. The river provided them with food, fresh water, and a path to nearby towns, but it also carried with it an undercurrent of fear. The older generation, with their wrinkled traces and stories of long-forgotten tragedies, warned the young to be cautious of its deceptive calm. It was said that the river could be unforgiving, that it was a vessel for spirits and dark forces waiting for the right moment to claim what it desired. Few believed these tales in full, yet the unspoken fear clung to the villagers, like the fog that blanketed the riverbank each morning. Among those who had come to call Thornton home was Ben, a man hardened by years of battle and haunted by the memories of war. His tall, lean frame moved stiffly, as if the weight of unseen burdens pressed down on his shoulders. Ben was not a man given to talk of his past. The scars on his face and the limp in his gait told more of his story than his words ever could. His eyes, deep set and often clouded with thought, bore the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much of the world's violence. He had fought, survived, and when the war ended, he sought only one thing: peace. The village of Thornton, with its tranquil appearance and distant hum of the river, seemed the perfect place to find it. Sarah, Ben's wife, was the anchor that kept him grounded. She was a soft-spoken woman with a gentle heart, her hair streaked with the first signs of grey. Her eyes still carried a warmth that spoke of resilience and love. She had stood by Ben through the worst of his struggles, and now, in this quiet village, she hoped they could finally leave behind the nightmares of war and build something new. The couple had only one child, a boy named Oliver, and he was their pride and joy. Oliver was everything the village adored: bright, charming, and filled with the unshakable energy of youth. His laughter often echoed through the streets, bringing life to the otherwise somber village. At 16, he was already admired for his wit and quick thinking, but what set him apart was his affinity with the river. He could swim like no other, cutting through the water with a grace that left others in awe. The fishermen, hardened by years of casting their nets, often watched him with a mix of admiration and envy, calling him the river otter for his natural ease in the water. To Oliver, the river was not something to fear but a friend, a companion that challenged him, pushed him to his limits, and offered him a sense of freedom. He spent hours diving beneath the surface, exploring its depths with the reckless abandon only a boy on the cusp of manhood could afford. Yet, even as he swam, his mother's warnings would echo in his mind. "Be careful of the river," Oliver Sarah would say, her voice tinged with unease. It has a mind of its own. It's taken lives before." Oliver would laugh it off, flashing her a confident grin. "I know the river, Mom. It's just water. Nothing to worry about." But Sarah's eyes would darken with a shadow of fear she could never quite shake. The river had been there long before any of them and would be there long after. It was ancient, patient, and at times merciless. The villagers of Thornton, though fond of Oliver and his adventurous spirit, shared Sarah's unspoken concern. They had seen the river's darker side too many times. The stories, passed down through generations, were not mere folklore to them. There was a tale of the fisherman who had drowned after his boat was capsized on a clear summer day with no logical explanation other than the river wanted him. And then there was the story of the miller's daughter, whose body was found tangled in reeds after she went missing, her eyes wide with terror, as if she had seen something unimaginable before her death. Some whispered that the river demanded sacrifices, a toll paid in blood to keep its waters calm. For the most part, life in Thornton went on as it always had, slowly, quietly, marked by the changing seasons and the steady flow of the river. The villagers tended to their fields, cast their fishing nets, and gathered in the evenings to exchange news and gossip. There was a simplicity to life here, one that seemed perfectly suited to Ben's desire for peace. He found solace in the routine, in the way the world narrowed down to the practical concerns of survival. But beneath the surface, both of the village and the river, something darker lingered. The village's deep-rooted superstitions were not easily dispelled. The locals lived in a kind of uneasy truce with the river, as if acknowledging that while they needed it for their livelihood, they could never fully trust it. There were subtle signs, little things that set Thornton apart from other places. No one swam in the river after sunset. Boats were always tied with red strings to ward off bad spirits. And every year, during the spring festival, offerings of bread and fish were left on the riverbank, just in case. Ben, for all his practical nature, couldn't help but feel the weight of these beliefs. They clung to the air like the heavy mist that hung over the village at dawn, impossible to ignore. He never mentioned it to Sarah or Oliver, but there were nights when he lay awake, listening to the sound of the river in the distance. Sometimes he thought he heard something else beneath the rushing water, a whisper, a murmur, like voices carried on the wind. He would shake it off, attributing it to the remnants of old war dreams that still haunted his sleep. Oliver, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the village's whispered warnings. He spent more time by the river than honing his swimming skills, challenging himself to dive deeper, stay underwater longer. It became a kind of ritual for him, a way to prove his mastery over the one thing the village feared. He had no patience for the old superstitions, brushing them off as relics of a time when people didn't know any better. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a blood-orange glow over the village, Oliver stood by the river's edge, gazing out at the water. The surface was smooth, reflecting the sky in perfect detail. For a moment, the world felt utterly still, as if holding its breath. Oliver felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine, but he shrugged it off, attributing it to the cool evening air. Just then, Ben appeared beside him, his face lined with worry. "You shouldn't be out here this late," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken fears. Oliver smiled, trying to ease his father's concern. "It's fine, Dad. The river's calm tonight. There's nothing to be afraid of." But Ben's gaze remained fixed on the water, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not the river I'm worried about," Oliver frowned, sensing something deeper in his father's words. "What do you mean?" Ben shook his head, as if shaking off the thought. "Never mind. Just come home. It's getting dark." Reluctantly, Oliver followed his father back towards the village, but as they walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The river, which had always felt like a place of freedom, now seemed to watch him, its dark waters concealing secrets he could not understand. Life in Thornton continued its steady pace. but the river's presence loomed larger in Oliver's mind. He could feel it calling to him, a silent, invisible pull that drew him back to its banks day after day. And with each visit, the unease that had settled in his chest grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. But Oliver was determined to prove, if only to himself, that the river held no power over him. It was just water, after all. He had swum in it countless times before. What could possibly go wrong? Yet, deep down beneath the bravado and youthful confidence, a sliver of doubt had taken root. A doubt that would soon bloom into something far more terrifying. For in Thornton, no one truly escaped the river's grasp. Part 2. The tragic flood. The rain began like a whisper, a soft pattering against the rooftops of Thornton that gently signaled the coming storm. At first, no one paid it much attention. After all, it wasn't uncommon for the skies above the village to darken with clouds and release a steady shower. But as the hours dragged on, the rain grew heavier, its gentle rhythm replaced by an incessant pounding, turning the earth into mud and swelling the river that wound its way through the village like a serpent awakening from a long slumber. Ben stood at the window of their small cottage, his brow furrowed as he watched the sheets of rain slanting down in the early morning light. The river, once a tranquil presence, now surged with a dangerous energy, its surface churning with anger as the storm's fury fed it. The village was used to rain, but this felt different. The sky was a deep, brooding grey, the kind that weighed heavily on the chest and set everyone on edge. By midday, the river had risen alarmingly, spilling over its banks and creeping dangerously close to the village's edge. Yet for all its ferocity, the villagers knew that life had to continue. Fishing was their livelihood, and rain or no rain, the river's bounty was what kept them alive. "We can't afford to wait this one out," Ben muttered to himself, his eyes flicking to his fishing gear by the door. From behind him, Sarah's voice cut through the tension in the room. "Ben, you're not seriously thinking of going out there, are you?" Her voice was laced with concern, and her eyes were wide with worry as she approached him. Ben turned to her, his jaw set. "We need the fish, Sarah. The storm could last for days, and if we don't catch something now, who knows how long we'll have to wait." Oliver, seated at the small wooden table in the corner of the room, listened quietly. He'd grown up watching his father fish, learning the skills that had been passed down through the generations. But today, even he felt a flicker of hesitation. The river wasn't just any river today, it was a beast, wild and unpredictable. "I'll come with you," Dad Oliver said, his voice steady, though inside he felt a pang of unease. He didn't want to show any fear in front of his father. Ben looked at him, proud but cautious. "You're sure?" he asked. He knew Oliver was a strong swimmer, but the river today wasn't something to take lightly. Oliver nodded. "I can handle it." Sarah stepped forward, her hands clutching at her apron, her voice trembling. "Please, both of you be careful. The river's dangerous today, more dangerous than usual. Something about it doesn't feel right." Ben placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be fine, Sarah. We know the river better than anyone," but as the two of them stepped out into the downpour, Sarah's heart clenched with a fear she couldn't quite explain. Something about the storm felt wrong, something deep and foreboding. The walk to the river was treacherous, the once familiar paths now slick with mud. The sound of the rain and wind was deafening, drowning out any other noise, making it hard to think, let alone talk. Ben and Oliver trudged forward, their faces set against the driving rain. The river was a roaring beast now, its banks swollen and angry, debris rushing by in the swift current. Broken branches, uprooted plants, and even large logs were carried downstream with terrifying speed. As they reached their usual fishing spot, Ben stopped for a moment, surveying the scene. The river was unrecognizable, wild and untamed, its waters lapping hungrily at the edge of the land, but they had come too far to turn back now. Ben handed Oliver the net, the familiar action grounding them both in the face of the storm's chaos. The two worked in near silence, casting their lines and setting their nets, but every few moments Ben would glance at the river's turbulent surface, his instinct screaming at him to leave. It was as though the river was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But they had no choice. The storm was unforgiving, and hunger was even less so. They were just beginning to haul in their first catch when a shout echoed through the roar of the storm. Ben froze, his heart pounding. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was calling for help. "Did you hear that?" Oliver asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Ben's eyes narrowed as he scanned the river. "Upstream," he said, his voice tense. "Someone's in trouble." Without a second thought, they abandoned their catch and began making their way up the river bank, slipping and stumbling over the wet ground as they went. The cries grew louder, more desperate, until finally they spotted him, a man clinging to a fallen tree, his body half submerged in the raging water. He was caught in the current, unable to free himself as the river threatened to pull him under. "Dad, we have to help him," Oliver shouted, his voice thick with urgency. Ben's mind raced. The man was too far out to reach from the shore, and the river's current was too strong for them to wade in without getting swept away themselves. But before Ben could stop him, Oliver was already moving. In one swift motion, he stripped off his jacket and dove into the water, his powerful strokes cutting through the churning river like a knife. Ben's heart leapt into his throat as he watched his son battle the torrent, his body barely visible against the dark, swirling water. "Oliver!" "No," Ben shouted, panic rising in his chest, but it was too late. Oliver swam with everything he had, his muscles straining as the river pushed back against him. He could feel the pull of the current, like invisible hands dragging him down, but he forced himself to keep going. The man's face was pale with terror, his eyes wide as he clung to the tree with a grip born of desperation. "I'm coming," Oliver yelled, his voice hoarse from the effort. He was almost there, just a few more feet. The current surged around him, swirling violently, but Oliver reached out, grabbing hold of the man's arm. "Hold on," Oliver gritted his teeth, pulling the man closer to him, trying to keep them both afloat. But the river had other plans. With a sudden, violent twist, the current caught them both, yanking them away from the safety of the tree and dragging them deeper into the river's deadly grip. Ben watched in horror as the two figures were pulled under, their bodies disappearing beneath the surface. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to jump in, to save his son. But he knew that if he did, the river would claim him too. He stood frozen on the bank, his body trembling, his mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. Oliver Ben's voice cracked as he screamed his son's name, but there was no response, only the deafening roar of the river as it swallowed them whole. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Ben's eyes scanned the river, desperately searching for any sign of his son, but all he could see was the relentless churning of the water, mocking him with its indifference. And then, just for a moment, Oliver's head broke the surface. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror, but the river wasn't done with him. With a final, cruel twist, the current pulled him under again, dragging him into its depths. No. Ben fell to his knees on the muddy bank, his hands clawing at the wet earth as if he could somehow pull his son back from the clutches of the river. But it was no use. The river had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before. The storm raged on, the rain falling harder, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the lives lost that day. Ben remained on the riverbank, his body shaking with sobs, his mind numb with the crushing weight of grief and guilt. He had lost Oliver, his son, his pride, his joy taken by the very river they had both thought they knew so well. The villagers found him hours later, still kneeling by the river's edge, his eyes vacant and unseeing, his voice hoarse from screaming his son's name into the storm. The river, silent now, flowed on, indifferent to the tragedy it had wrought, and somewhere beneath its dark, murky waters, Oliver's body drifted, lost to the depths. Part 3. The family's grief. The days following the flood were a blur of cold, grey skies and the ceaseless whisper of rain. The storm had subsided, leaving the village of Thornton to reckon with the aftermath, but for Ben and Sarah, the worst of the storm still raged within them. Oliver's body had not surfaced, and the river, once a source of life, now felt like an abyss that had swallowed their world whole. For 3 days they waited. 3 agonizing days of standing by the riverbank, eyes fixed on the murky water, hoping against hope that Oliver might somehow come back. But on the 4th day, reality struck with a cruelty that no parent should ever face. It was one of the fishermen who found him. Down by the rocks the man had muttered, his eyes averted, unwilling to meet Ben's gaze. The fisherman's voice trembled as he spoke, and though his words were few, they carried the weight of something terrible. Ben didn't hear the rest. His body moved on instinct, numb and unfeeling, as he stumbled towards the river, toward the place where his son had been found. His heart beat wildly in his chest, each thud echoing the name of the boy he had lost, the boy he could not save. By the time he reached the spot, the villagers had already gathered, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They parted wordlessly as Ben approached, revealing what lay between the rocks. Oliver. But this was not the Oliver who had once been the light of their lives, not the boy who had laughed and swum through these very waters with such grace. The body that lay before him was a grotesque, bloated thing, the river's cruel handiwork evident in every twisted feature. His skin, once tanned from the summer sun, was now sickly pale, mottled with shades of purple and grey. His limbs, swollen from days in the water, lay at odd angles, as if they no longer belonged to him. Ben dropped to his knees, the weight of the world crashing down on him as he stared at what remained of his son. His hands trembled as he reached out, but he couldn't bring himself to touch the body. His mind screamed at him that this couldn't be real, that this couldn't be Oliver. And yet, there he was, stolen from them by the very river he had loved so much. Ben, it was Sarah. Her voice, so soft it was almost a whisper, broke through the fog of his grief. She stood behind him, her face ashen, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She hadn't spoken much since the day Oliver went missing, her grief a silent, suffocating presence in their home. Now, as she stepped closer to her son's body, her hands flew to her mouth, and a choked sob escaped her lips. Ben watched as Sarah's legs gave out beneath her, collapsing onto the wet ground beside him. She reached out, her fingers barely brushing Oliver's cold, lifeless skin, before she recoiled in horror, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. He was just a boy, she cried, her voice breaking. He was only 16. How could this happen? How could the river take him from us? The words tore through Ben like shards of glass, each syllable embedding itself deep in his chest. He had no answers for her, no comfort to give. All he had were his own screams, silent and trapped inside, buried beneath layers of guilt and helplessness. It was his fault. If only he had been quicker, if only he had stopped Oliver from jumping into the river. If only he hadn't let his son out of his sight. The guilt gnawed at him, an insidious voice in the back of his mind that whispered over and over, "You let him die." The villagers, who had gathered in a loose circle around the grieving parents, remained silent. But their silence was not one of respect or sorrow, it was thick with something else. Whispers had already begun to spread through Thornton, carried on the same wind that had swept away the storm. The river took him. One woman murmured to another, her voice barely audible, but cutting through the air like a blade. "It's an old story. The river spirit demands a life every so often. Oliver, he was the sacrifice." Ben overheard the words, and for a moment his sorrow gave way to rage. Sacrifice? How could they say that? Oliver was no offering, he was his son, a boy full of life, taken too soon by a cruel twist of fate, not some ancient superstition. But as Ben's eyes darted from face to face, he saw that the villagers believed it. In their eyes, the tragedy was more than an accident. It was a sign, a dark omen that had played out before. Old man Thomas, who had lived through more floods and storms than anyone in the village, was the first to speak the words aloud that many had already been thinking. "The river's always been hungry," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I've seen it before. Every few years it takes someone. We all know it. The spirit beneath the water. It needed a life this time. It chose Oliver." Sarah's sobbing grew louder as the old man's words reached her ears, her hands clawing at the earth, as if trying to hold on to something solid, something real. But reality was slipping through her fingers, replaced by a growing sense of dread of something more sinister at play. The superstitions that had always lingered in the background, the stories told by the elders in whispers and glances, now felt all too real. Even Ben, who had never believed in the old tales, felt a shiver run down his spine. He wanted to reject the idea, to push away the absurdity of it all, but the way the villagers stared at him, some with pity, others with fear, unsettled him. It was as if they were all waiting for him to acknowledge the truth that had taken root in their minds. The river had demanded a sacrifice, and Oliver had been its chosen victim. Rumors began to spread like wildfire, fueled by the villagers' fear and their need to make sense of the senseless tragedy. Some claimed to have seen strange lights over the water the night before the flood, ghostly figures dancing along the riverbank. Others spoke of hearing whispers in the wind, voices that call out in the night, beckoning someone to the river's depths. The river spirit is real, one woman swore to her neighbor. It's ancient, older than this village. We've forgotten how to honor it, and now it's angry. It wasn't long before the stories twisted further, growing darker with each retelling. People began to say that Oliver's death was no accident, that he had been marked long before the storm, chosen by the river spirit as payment for the village's neglect. The villagers whispered that they should have made offerings, should have paid tribute, but they hadn't, and now the river had taken what it was owed. As the days passed, the weight of these rumors began to crush Ben and Sarah. It was as though the village itself was turning against them, branding them as the parents of the cursed boy, the boy who had angered the river spirit and paid the ultimate price. The whispers haunted them at every turn, in every glance cast their way, until the grief that consumed them was no longer just for the loss of their son. It was tainted by the dark cloud of superstition that hung over their heads. Sarah's grief twisted into something else, something raw and primal. She became consumed by the idea that the river had stolen her son, that it had claimed him as its own. She could hardly eat, hardly sleep. Her once warm and gentle demeanor had been replaced by a hollow, haunted look that chilled Ben to the bone. Each night, as Ben lay awake beside her in their empty bed, he could hear her muttering to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. The river took him. The river took our boy Ben, racked with his own guilt, said nothing. He didn't know how to comfort her when he couldn't even comfort himself. How could he tell her that the river hadn't taken Oliver, that it had just been a terrible accident, when deep down, even he was beginning to doubt. The river had always been a part of their lives, but now it seemed like something much darker, something that had always been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as the days dragged on, Ben began to feel that maybe the villagers were right. Maybe the river had taken Oliver. Maybe there was something more to the currents that ran beneath the surface, something old and hungry that they had all forgotten. But what haunted him most of all was the thought that it wasn't just the river that had claimed his son. It was him. His hesitation, his failure to act, his inability to stop Oliver from diving into the water that day, it was all his fault. He had let the river take his boy. And now, as the village mourned, as the rumors grew darker, Ben and Sarah were left alone with their grief, the weight of their loss crushing them from all sides. There was no escaping it. Every corner of their home reminded them of the boy they had lost, the empty chair at the table, the coat still hanging by the door, the half-finished schoolwork on his desk. Oliver's presence was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that haunted their every waking moment. But worst of all was the river. No matter where they went in the village, they could hear its ceaseless whisper, calling out to them, reminding them of what it had taken. Part 4. The Manipulative Fortune Teller. The death of Oliver cast a long, dark shadow over the village of Thornton. Even after his bloated, lifeless body had been pulled from the river, the whispers and rumors refused to die. The village, already steeped in superstition, clung to the notion that the river had demanded a sacrifice alive for its unspoken, ancient wrath Oliver had been that sacrifice, the villagers said, and his tragic end was no accident. But it wasn't just the villagers who believed this. The guilt and grief that gnawed at Ben and Sarah had warped into something darker, something that whispered to them in the dead of night. There was no relief from the relentless weight of their loss. Oliver's spirit, they feared, was still out there trapped, restless, bound to the river's will. It was in this fog of grief and fear that Master Cole entered their lives. Master Cole was known in Thornton as a fortune teller, but those who spoke of him did so in hushed tones, their voices tinged with both awe and fear. He was a man of mystery, an outsider who had settled in the village many years ago. No one knew exactly where he had come from, but he had quickly gained a reputation as someone who could communicate with the unseen forces that supposedly governed the land. Some believed he had an ancient connection to the spirits of the river, while others whispered that he dabbled in darker arts. His small, shadowy cottage sat on the outskirts of Thornton, far enough away from the village that it always seemed cloaked in mist, even on the brightest of days. It was a place people went to only when they had nowhere else to turn, when their crops failed, when illness struck, or when the weight of loss became too much to bear. And now, as Ben and Sarah wandered in the fog of their grief, it was to Master Cole they turned, desperate for any semblance of peace. It was a damp, cold morning when they stood before his door, hesitant but determined. Sarah clutched Ben's arm, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes rimmed with the bruises of sleepless nights. Ben, for his part, looked hollowed out by the guilt that gnawed at him. They had heard from a neighbor that Master Cole had the power to reach the spirits of the dead, to guide them to peace. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Ben knocked, his knuckles brushing against the weathered wood of the door. It creaked open without a sound, as if it had been expecting them. The interior was dim, lit only by flickering candles placed haphazardly on shelves cluttered with strange, ancient objects. The air was thick with the smell of burning herbs, a pungent aroma that immediately made Sarah's eyes water. From the shadows, Master Cole emerged. He was tall and thin, with long bony fingers and a face lined with the weight of too many secrets. His eyes, black and sharp, seemed to pierce right through them, as if he already knew everything about their sorrow, their desperation. "You've come," he said softly, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He gestured for them to enter, and they hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Master Cole's gaze lingered on them, his lips curling into something that was almost a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're here because of your boy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Oliver Sarah gasped, clutching Ben's arm tighter. "Hedge, how do you know?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Master Cole's eyes flicked to hers, unblinking. "The river speaks," he replied cryptically. "It tells me many things." Ben felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This man, this strange, unsettling figure, seemed to know more than he should, but the grief was too deep, too consuming to care. If this man could help them, if he could bring some sense of peace to Oliver's spirit, then what did it matter how he knew? We need your help," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "Oliver, his spirit is not at peace. We need to know if there's something we can do. Please, we'll do anything." Master Cole studied them for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if weighing their souls. Then he nodded slowly, turning away to the far side of the room where an altar stood, cluttered with symbols and items they didn't understand. He began to light more candles, muttering words under his breath that neither Ben nor Sarah could make out. "The boy's spirit is trapped," Master Cole said, his voice low and serious. "The river has claimed him, yes, but it has not let him go. His soul is bound to the water, restless and angry. If you do not act soon, it will remain there forever, and the river will demand more." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. "More," she whispered, horrified. Master Cole turned to them, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "The river hungers. If Oliver's soul is not set free, it may take another from your family, or another from the village. The river has been known to demand not one life but many. Ben felt his legs weaken beneath him. The thought of losing Sarah, or worse, someone else in the village, was unbearable. What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is a ritual," Master Cole said, his voice grave. "A ritual to free the boy's spirit, to appease the river and ensure that no more lives are taken. But it is not without cost." Ben and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in unison. They had known there would be a price, there always was, but the urgency in Master Cole's voice filled them with a fresh sense of dread. Still, they had come this far, they couldn't turn back now. What kind of cost? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Master Cole's expression darkened. "It is a delicate ritual, one that requires certain offerings. These offerings must be made to the river, and they must be made soon, before the spirit becomes too strong to be contained." He paused, his eyes flickering between them, as if gauging their willingness to pay the price. "There are materials I will need to procure, sacred items, and these are not easily obtained. It will be expensive, but it is the only way." Sarah's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth. "We don't have much," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We barely have enough to get by." Ben placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart heavy. "We'll find a way," he said firmly, though inside, he felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. "Just tell us what we need to do." Master Cole nodded slowly, his bony fingers tracing strange symbols in the air as he spoke. "You will need to prepare an offering of fish and bread to be laid at the river's edge. Then you must wait for me. I will bring the necessary items, and together we will perform the ritual. But remember this, once the ritual begins, there is no turning back. The river will take what it is owed." Sarah shuddered, her mind racing. The words felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, but she couldn't bear the thought of Oliver's spirit suffering, lost and bound to the river forever. "We'll do it," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll do whatever it takes." Master Cole's lips curled into a thin smile. "Good," he said. "I will return in 2 nights' time." Be ready. The walk back to the village was a blur, the weight of their decision bearing down on them like a laden cloak. The air around them seemed heavier, colder, as if the village itself had changed. Sarah clung to Ben's arm as they walked, her mind swirling with images of the ritual, of the river's dark depths, of Oliver's spirit trapped beneath its surface, calling out to them for help. But beneath the grief, beneath the desperation, a small voice whispered doubt. Could they really trust Master Cole? His eyes, the way he had spoken it had felt wrong somehow. But what other choice did they have? Ben's mind raced with the same thoughts, but he silenced them quickly. They were doing what they had to. It was the only way to save Oliver, to bring him peace. And if it cost them everything they had, then so be it. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in silence, listening to the sound of the river outside, its soft rhythmic flow suddenly seeming more sinister, more alive. The river had taken their son, and now they were bound to it in a way they had never been before. As dawn broke, casting a pale, grey light over the village, they rose from bed, exhausted but resolute. There was no turning back now. The river had its hold on them, and they would do whatever it took to break free. 2 nights later, when Master Cole returned, the storm clouds gathered once more, casting a dark veil over the village. The ritual was about to begin. Part 5. The Dark Ritual. The night of the ritual arrived with an unsettling chill in the air, the kind that gnawed at the skin and burrowed deep into the bones. The village of Thornton lay in a tense hush, as if the very land itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The moon, once bright and full, now hung in the sky like a sickle, casting an eerie silver glow over the world. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, threatening to devour the light completely. Ben and Sarah stood at the edge of the village, waiting in the cold, their hearts heavy with grief and dread. They had gathered the offerings as Master Cole had instructed: fish, bread, and a few other small items of personal value, and now they waited for the man who claimed he could bring peace to their son's spirit. Sarah clutched Ben's arm tightly, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow from nights of sleepless torment. Her lips trembled as she whispered into the darkness, "Do you think this will really help him, Ben? Do you think Oliver will finally rest?" Ben didn't answer right away. He wanted to tell her yes, to reassure her that this was the right thing to do. But the truth was, a gnawing doubt had taken root in his heart. The air felt wrong tonight, thick with tension, like the moments before a storm breaks. The more he thought about Master Cole, the more he began to question the man's true intentions. But they were here now, and there was no turning back. A figure appeared from the shadows, moving slowly toward them. Master Cole, draped in a long, flowing robe that seemed to blend with the darkness, approached with an air of grim authority. The candles he held flickered wildly in the wind, casting grotesque shadows on his face. His eyes gleamed with something cold and unnatural, though he smiled thinly at them. "It is time," he intoned, his voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to cut through the wind like a blade. "Come, we must begin." Without a word, Ben and Sarah followed Master Cole down the path that led away from the village and toward the old graveyard at the edge of the forest. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees, as if nature itself was protesting what was about to take place. Sarah stumbled as they walked, her mind clouded with grief, but Ben caught her, pulling her close as they continued their grim march. The graveyard loomed ahead, a dark, forgotten place where the dead lay in uneasy slumber. The stones were cracked and worn, many of the names etched into them long since faded. The earth beneath their feet felt wrong, soft and damp, as if it had been disturbed too recently. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible, but filled with malice. Even the air itself had grown colder, biting at their skin as they approached the center of the graveyard. At the heart of it all stood a single, twisted tree, its branches gnarled and reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Beneath its roots was a clearing where Master Cole had arranged an altar. The offerings were placed carefully on the stone, surrounded by strange symbols etched into the ground. The candles flickered ominously, casting long, wavering shadows over the graves. "Place the offerings here," Master Cole instructed, his voice thick with an unsettling authority. "Once the ceremony begins, you must not move, and you must not speak. Whatever happens, you must trust the ritual." Ben felt a chill race down his spine, and his grip tightened on Sarah's hand. Something about this felt deeply wrong, but they were too far gone to turn back now. They placed the offerings on the altar, as instructed: fish, bread, a small pendant that had belonged to Oliver, and stepped back, watching as Master Cole began his preparations. The air grew heavier, laden with an unnatural energy that seemed to pulse with every breath. The wind howled louder, swirling around them like an unseen force, tugging at their clothes and hair. Master Cole stood before the altar, his eyes closed, his lips moving in strange, guttural chants that seemed to echo unnaturally in the night. The symbols around the altar began to glow faintly, pulsing with a dull red light that only added to the growing sense of unease. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, each beat thudding louder and faster as the ritual progressed. He glanced at Sarah, who stood beside him, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the altar. Her face was pale, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She looked terrified, but there was something else in her expression: hope, a desperate hope that this ritual would bring their son peace. Master Cole's chanting grew louder, more insistent. The words were incomprehensible, filled with harsh consonants and guttural sounds that made Ben's skin crawl. The flames from the candles flickered wildly, dancing in the wind as if alive, casting eerie shadows across the graveyard. The symbols on the ground pulsed faster, the red glow intensifying until it was almost too bright to look at. Suddenly the wind shifted, swirling violently around the clearing. The temperature dropped sharply, and Ben could see his breath misting in the air. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and he felt a deep, unsettling rumble from the earth below. Something was wrong, something was terribly, horribly wrong. He turned to Master Cole, his voice trembling as he called out, "What's happening? Is this supposed to?" Silence. Master Cole's voice cracked like a whip, harsh and commanding. His eyes snapped open, blazing with an intensity that sent a wave of fear through Ben. You must not speak. The ritual is not yet complete. But Ben's instincts screamed at him that they were in danger. This wasn't just a ritual to bring peace to Oliver's spirit. This was something darker, something far more sinister. His eyes darted around the clearing, taking in the strange symbols, the flickering candles, the airy glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air was thick with a presence, something old and malevolent, something that had been awakened by the ritual. Sarah, standing beside him, suddenly let out a small cry, her hand flying to her mouth as she staggered backward. Her eyes were wide with horror, fixed on something in the shadows beyond the altar. Ben turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest as he followed her gaze. There, just beyond the flickering candlelight, stood a figure. At first it was hard to make out, just a faint outline in the darkness. But as Ben's eyes adjusted, he saw it more clearly, a tall, gaunt figure draped in tattered rags, its skin pale and mottled, its eyes black and hollow. It stood motionless, watching them with an eerie stillness, its presence filling the air with a sense of dread so thick it was suffocating. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Who? Who is that? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Master Cole didn't answer. His chanting grew louder, more frantic, as if he were trying to drown out the very presence of the figure. The candles flickered violently, threatening to extinguish with each gust of wind, but the red glow from the symbols on the ground intensified, casting an unnatural light over the clearing. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes never leaving Ben and Sarah. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that went beyond the natural world. Ben could feel it in his bones, a primal fear that screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. Ben Sarah's voice trembled with fear. Ben, we need to stop this. Something's wrong. I know, Ben whispered back, his eyes darting to Master Cole, who seemed oblivious to their terror. The fortune teller was lost in his own world, his chants rising to a fever pitch, his hands outstretched toward the glowing symbols, as if commanding some dark force. The figure took another step forward, and Ben's heart pounded in his chest. We have to stop this, he said more urgently, his voice louder now. Cole, stop. This isn't right, but Master Cole didn't respond. His chanting grew louder, more frantic, his hands moving in strange, jerking motions as if guiding an unseen power. The wind howled louder, swirling around them like a tornado, and the figure in the shadows stepped closer, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Cole Ben shouted, fear and anger bubbling up inside him. Stop this now, but it was too late. With a final, guttural roar, Master Cole slammed his hands down onto the altar, and the ground beneath them erupted with a violent force. The red glow from the symbols flared bright, blinding them for a moment, and the wind whipped into a frenzy, pulling at their clothes and hair, as if trying to drag them into the earth. Ben staggered back, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. The figure in the shadows was gone, but the oppressive weight of its presence lingered in the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the very earth seeming to pulse with dark energy. And then, with a sudden deafening silence, everything stopped. The wind died, the glow from the symbols faded, the candles flickered out, plunging the graveyard into darkness. Ben and Sarah stood frozen, their hearts racing, their bodies trembling with fear. Master Cole stood at the altar, his chest heaving with exertion, his eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin on his face. It is done, he whispered, his voice thick with triumph. The ritual is complete. But as Ben stared at the man before him, a cold, sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't peace. This wasn't closure. This was something far darker, something that should never have been unleashed. And now, it was too late to stop it. Part 6. Oliver's spirit returns. The night had fallen into a suffocating silence after the conclusion of the dark ritual. The eerie red glow had faded, and the symbols etched into the earth were now nothing more than faint markings in the dirt. The wind, which had howled violently throughout the ceremony, now lay still, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, his body trembling not just from the cold, but from the intense dread that now suffused the air around them. He glanced at Sarah, who stood frozen beside him, her face pale and drawn. Her wide eyes flickered with both fear and confusion, and Ben could see the tremor in her hands as she clutched the hem of her coat, knuckles white. Master Cole stood before the altar, his chest heaving with exertion, his bony hands still outstretched towards the sky. A twisted grin curled his thin lips as he turned to face them, the shadows cast by the candles stretching his gaunt features into something monstrous. "It is done," Master Cole rasped, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Oliver's spirit will find peace now. You have nothing more to fear." But as his words hung in the air, Ben felt something stir deep inside him, an unsettling, primal instinct that screamed that something was horribly wrong. This wasn't right. The oppressive atmosphere, the twisted ceremony, the malevolent energy that lingered, it all felt wrong. And then, as if in answer to the growing dread in his chest, the temperature plummeted. The air around them turned icy, and the faint mist that had risen from the ground thickened, swirling unnaturally around their feet. The once clear night sky darkened further, as though an invisible force was drawing the very light from the stars above. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He felt Sarah's grip tighten on his arm as she too sensed the change, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing. The graveyard, already a place of death and decay, now seemed alive with something far more sinister. And then, without warning, the faint glow of the altar flickered. The candles that had burned throughout the ritual sputtered as though caught in a sudden gust of wind. But the air was still. Master Cole's smile faltered. From the corner of his eye, Ben noticed something shifting in the shadows just beyond the altar. His heart raced as he turned his gaze toward the movement. Squinting through the thickening mist, a figure emerged, barely visible at first, just a faint outline against the inky blackness. But as it drew closer, it became unmistakable. Ben's breath hitched in his throat. His blood turned to ice. It was Oliver, but not as they had remembered him. Gone was the bright, mischievous boy who had filled their lives with light. The figure that stood before them was gaunt and pale, his skin sickly and translucent as though drained of all warmth. His once lively eyes, now hollow and shadowed, gazed at them from beneath dark, sunken sockets. His clothes hung loosely from his frail form, soaked as though he had just emerged from the river that had claimed his life. Oliver Sarah's voice broke, barely more than a whisper, choked with a mother's grief and disbelief. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand reaching out toward the apparition of her son. "My boy, is it really you?" But Oliver didn't move. His expression was somber, his gaze heavy with sorrow, and though his eyes met his mother's, there was no joy in the reunion. Instead, there was only a profound sadness, one that seemed to stretch beyond the grave. Ben could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage, the shock of seeing his son again nearly overwhelming. But there was something else too, something darker. This wasn't the closure they had hoped for. This wasn't the peaceful release that Master Cole had promised. "Mom." Dad Oliver's voice was soft, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It held none of the warmth or vitality it once had, and the sound of it sent a shiver down Ben's spine. "You've been deceived," the words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. For a moment, neither Ben nor Sarah moved, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Deceived? What was Oliver talking about? Hadn't they just completed the ritual to bring him peace? "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Oliver, what do you mean? We did this for you, to help you find peace." Oliver's hollow gaze shifted to Master Cole, who stood motionless, his eyes narrowing with something that looked like annoyance rather than surprise. The fortune teller said nothing, but the air around him seemed to darken, as though he were drawing the shadows closer around him, preparing to defend himself. "I am not at peace," Oliver continued, his voice stronger now, but still laced with sorrow. "This man, Master Cole, he has no power to help me. He's been lying to you. He's using your grief, your desperation, To take advantage of you, Ben's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Master Cole, anger and disbelief warring within him. Is this true? He demanded, his voice rising with fury. You said this ritual would bring our son peace. You said I said what you needed to hear, Master Cole interrupted, his voice cold and emotionless. The air around him seemed to crackle with malice. You were willing to pay for hope, and I gave it to you. Ben's hands balled into fists at his sides, rage flooding his veins. You used us. You used our son's death to line your pockets. Master Cole sneered, the facade of sympathy and wisdom now fully replaced by cold indifference. You came to me, desperate and broken. You wanted answers, you wanted closure. I simply provided a service. Ben lunged forward, his anger overwhelming his sense of reason. But Oliver's voice stopped him in his tracks. Don't, Oliver said softly, his hollow eyes filled with sorrow. It's too late now. He can't help me. No one can. Sarah let out a sob, her knees buckling as she collapsed to the ground. No. This can't be true. We did everything we could. We just wanted to help you. Oliver, please. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling as the weight of the truth crushed her. Ben knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her as she wept, his own heart shattering beneath the unbearable weight of failure. They had wanted to save their son, to bring him peace. But instead they had been manipulated, their grief exploited by a man with no conscience. Oliver stepped closer, his figure barely visible through the mist that swirled around him. It's not your fault, he whispered, his voice filled with sadness. You wanted to help me, but there's nothing you could have done. My spirit is tied to the river now, and I'm afraid it always will be. Ben's chest tightened as Oliver's words sank in. The river, the very thing they had thought they could appease, had taken their son, and now it would hold him forever. There was no ritual, no offering that could change that. I'm sorry, Oliver whispered, his gaze softening as he looked at his parents. I didn't want this. I never wanted this. But it's not too late for you. You need to leave this place. Don't let the river take you too. The cold warning in his voice sent a shiver down Ben's spine. He felt the oppressive weight of the graveyard closing in around them, the mist thickening as though it were alive, hungry. There was something malevolent in the air, something that had been awakened by the ritual, and it wasn't just Oliver's spirit. You've been lied to, Oliver repeated, his voice growing fainter. The river is old, older than this village, older than any of us. It demands more, always more. You need to leave before it takes you too. The ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The air around them turned heavy, suffocating, as if the very fabric of the world was warping under the weight of the dark forces they had unleashed. Master Cole stepped back, his eyes flickering with a strange mix of fear and anger. No, he hissed, his voice filled with defiance. This cannot be. I control the spirits. I am the one with the power. But as he spoke, the shadows seemed to close in around him. The ground beneath the altar cracked, thin fissures spreading like black veins. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the very earth seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as though it had been disturbed from its long slumber. Oliver's figure began to fade, his form dissolving into the mist. Leave this place, he whispered one final time, before it's too late. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Ben and Sarah stood frozen, the weight of Oliver's warning pressing down on them like a vice. The graveyard around them seemed to shift, the once silent tombstones now feeling like they were watching, waiting. Master Cole let out a furious roar, his voice echoing through the night. I will not be defied by a mere child's spirit. He raised his hands, chanting furiously, his voice desperate as he tried to regain control of the ritual. But it was too late. The earth beneath their feet groaned, and the ground split open with a deafening crack, the mist swirling up from the depths like a living thing. The ritual had awakened something far older, far darker than any of them had realized. And now it was coming for them. Part 7. Confronting the Truth. The night felt suffocating, every breath thick with the weight of an unspeakable truth. As the mist that had once been Oliver's form dissolved into the oppressive darkness, the chilling silence that followed filled the graveyard. Ben stood motionless, his heart pounding, every muscle in his body screaming for action, for justice. His mind was still reeling from the revelation Oliver's death had not been the result of a curse. There was no vengeful spirit of the river, no ancient forces demanding a sacrifice. They had been deceived. His pulse quickened as the enormity of their betrayal crashed over him, like the rising floodwaters that had claimed Oliver's life. Every ounce of hope he had clung to, every prayer he had muttered under his breath, in the desperate belief that they could save their son's soul, now crumbled to dust. The truth was far more bitter. They had been led astray by the twisted lies of a manipulative man. Ben's gaze snapped to Master Cole, who stood just a few paces away, his skeletal form barely visible in the dim light of the extinguished candles. Cole's eyes, once filled with the smug confidence of a man who controlled people's fears, now flickered with panic. The fortune teller's thin lips curled into a snarl, but the bravado was gone, replaced by a flicker of something that Ben recognized immediately. Fear, Ben growled, his voice thick with rage, each syllable like the crack of thunder in the quiet graveyard. He took a step forward, his fist clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. You lied to us. You used us. Used our grief. Our son's death. Master Cole backed away, his eyes darting from Ben to Sarah, who stood silently beside her husband, her face pale, tear-streaked and hollow. There was no strength left in her, no fight. The betrayal had broken her spirit. She barely registered the world around her anymore. The only thing that existed for her now was the void where Oliver had once been. Ben, please, Cole stammered, his hands raised defensively as he stumbled backward, his foot catching on a jagged gravestone. He almost fell, but managed to steady himself, his wide eyes locked on Ben's advancing figure. You don't understand. I don't, Ben shouted, his voice raw and trembling with fury. Don't you dare say another word. You lied to us. You told us this would help Oliver, that we could bring him peace. But it was all a lie. You preyed on us, you monster. The fury that had built up inside Ben finally boiled over. Without thinking, without pausing, he lunged at Cole, his body propelled by the sheer force of his grief and rage. His hand shot out, grabbing the front of the fortune teller's robe, yanking him forward with such force that Cole let out a strangled gasp, his bony hands clawing at Ben's grip. You took advantage of us. Ben snarled, his face inches from Cole's. You made us believe that our son's death was part of some curse, that the river demanded a sacrifice. But it was all just to line your pockets, wasn't it? You never cared about Oliver. You never cared about us. Cole's eyes widened with terror as he struggled against Ben's iron grip, but the more he tried to pull away, the tighter Ben's hold became. The fortune teller's thin, pale lips quivered, but no words came out. His once commanding presence had shattered, leaving only the quaking shell of a man who had thrived on the suffering of others. Please, Cole gasped, his voice trembling. I can explain. Ben's other fist shot out, connecting with Cole's face with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent Cole sprawling backward, his thin frame hitting the ground with a thud. His head snapped back, blood trickling from his nose and lips as he struggled to sit up, groaning in pain. I should kill you, Ben roared, advancing on him again, his chest heaving with fury. You deserve to die for what you've done. But even as the words left his lips, a cold hand caught Ben's wrist, hurting him in his tracks. Ben's breath hitched as he turned, his anger still burning hot in his veins. It was Sarah. Her face, streaked with tears and hollow with grief, was pale, but her eyes, though filled with sorrow, held a plea for mercy. Ben, stop, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. It won't bring Oliver back. Ben froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his muscles trembling with the weight of his fury. For a moment he just stood there, his fists still clenched, his eyes locked on Cole, who lay on the ground, cowering beneath him like a beaten dog. Everything inside Ben screamed for justice, for revenge, for the chance to make Cole feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused them. But Sarah's words cut through the red haze of rage that clouded his vision. It wouldn't bring Oliver back. No amount of blood, no act of violence would undo the past. Oliver was gone, taken by the river, by the cruel hand of fate. Nothing could change that. Slowly, painfully, Ben released his grip on Sarah's arm and took a step back, his chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. The anger was still there, burning like a fire in his soul, but it was tempered now by the cold truth that nothing could bring his son back. Nothing. Master Cole, sensing the shift in Ben's demeanor, scrambled to his feet, blood still dripping from his nose and lips. His eyes darted between Ben and Sarah, and for a brief moment they seemed to flicker with something like hope, a hope that he might yet escape with his life. I was only trying to help, Cole stammered, his voice weak and broken, as though he were trying to salvage the last shreds of his dignity. You wanted hope. I gave you hope. Ben's jaw clenched, and he took another step forward, his gaze cold and unyielding. You lied to us. You preyed on our grief. Don't pretend you were trying to help us. You were only helping yourself. Cole's mouth opened, as if to protest, but the words died in his throat. The truth was out now, and even he couldn't deny it any longer. His carefully constructed web of lies had unraveled, and there was no way to repair the damage. Without another word, Master Cole turned and bolted into the night, his long robe flapping behind him like the wings of some predatory bird fleeing from the light. The mist swallowed him whole, and within moments he was gone, vanishing into the darkness from which he had come. For a long moment, Ben and Sarah stood in silence, their hearts still pounding in their chests, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on them like a tidal wave. The graveyard was eerily quiet now, the mist that had swirled around them slowly dissipating into the cold night air. There were no more whispers, no flickers of ghostly light. The dark presence that had once loomed over them was gone, leaving only the two of them standing alone among the graves. Ben turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with sorrow and guilt. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have known. I should have listened to Oliver." As Sarah shook her head, her lips trembling as fresh tears welled in her eyes. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We both wanted to believe. We both thought we were doing what was best for him. But now we know the truth. The word hung in the air like a weight, suffocating them both. The truth was that their son's death had not been caused by a curse, by any supernatural force. It had been a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate that had stolen Oliver from them too soon. And they had been manipulated, deceived by a man who had taken advantage of their grief and their desperate need for answers. But none of that changed the reality. Oliver was gone, and nothing they did, no ritual, no offering, could bring him back. There was no peace to be found in that graveyard, no comfort to be taken from the lies they had been fed. Only the cold, brutal truth remained. "I don't know what to do," Ben said softly, his voice filled with the weight of his despair. "How do we go on from this? How do we live with the fact that we were tricked like this?" Sarah's gaze softened, and she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We remember Oliver," she whispered. "We remember the good in him, the light he brought into our lives. We don't let this man, take that away from us." Ben looked into her eyes, seeing the pain reflected in her gaze, but also the strength that had carried them through so much already. Slowly he nodded, squeezing her hand tightly. They had been deceived, manipulated by a man who had thrived on the suffering of others. But the love they had for their son was real, and that was something no one could ever take from them. As they stood together in the cold, silent graveyard surrounded by the shadows of the dead, Ben realized that the only way forward was to leave this place behind, to carry Oliver's memory with them, and to let go of the lies that had ensnared them. It was time to face the truth, and to begin the long, painful process of healing. Part 8. Master Cole's Downfall. The night had not yet fully passed when the first villager spotted him. Master Cole, once the feared and revered fortune teller, now a shell of a man staggering through the mist just beyond the village. His once elaborate robe, which had marked him as a man of power and authority, now hung from his thin frame like a shroud, torn and smeared with dirt. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were wide and glassy, staring into nothingness. His mouth twitched uncontrollably as he muttered incoherently, words spilling out like the ramblings of a lunatic, disjointed and meaningless to anyone who might listen. Spirits. They came, they whispered. They promised. Cole's voice was cracked and dry, his words slurred and broken. I had control. I did. They were mine to command. Mine, his once commanding presence, was now that of a man lost, his mind shattered by forces far beyond his understanding. He stumbled through the early morning fog, his feet dragged in through the damp earth, oblivious to the stares of those who began to gather around him. The villagers, many of whom had once sought Cole's counsel in fear and now looked on with a mix of confusion, fear, and pity. It was a pitiful sight, this man who had so confidently woven tales of curses and spirits, who had held the village in the palm of his hand, reduced to little more than a muttering madman. At first no one dared approach him. The air was still thick with the tension from the previous night, the weight of what had transpired pressing down on them all. They had heard whispers of what had happened in the graveyard, of Ben and Sarah's encounter with the spirit of their son, and of Cole's deceit. But now, seeing him in this state, their hearts were filled with a cold realization. The powerful fortune teller, the man who had claimed mastery over the supernatural, had been brought low by the very forces he had sought to manipulate. It was an ironic twist, almost poetic in its cruelty. Cursed Cole mumbled, his voice barely more than a rasp as he staggered forward, his hands grasping at the air as if trying to pull something unseen toward him. The curse. It's upon me. Upon us all. They will come for you too. All of you. His words, nonsensical and feverish, only deepened the villagers' discomfort. They watched him with wide eyes, their fear of him eroding into something far darker disdain. Cole had fooled them all, had preyed on their fears for so long, and now they were witnessing the true cost of his deception. Is it real? Someone whispered from the crowd, their voice laced with uncertainty. The spirits. The curse is not real, another villager answered, their tone harsh, angry. He's just a madman now. He was never in control. He never had power over anything but our minds. But despite the bitterness in those words, there was an underlying fear that gnawed at them all. The superstitions Cole had fostered ran deep, and even now, seeing him broken and crazed, they couldn't fully shake the belief that something dark had indeed been unleashed. Cole stumbled again, nearly falling to his knees, but he caught himself, his hands clawing at the ground as he struggled to rise. His face was twisted in a grotesque mask of terror and confusion, his lips moving rapidly as he mumbled to himself. They whispered. They told me, he gasped, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. But they lied. They lied. His voice cracked, and he let out a ragged scream, a sound so full of anguish and fear that it made the villagers recoil. Ben stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He watched Cole with a burning anger still smoldering in his chest, but it was tempered now by a sickening sense of pity. The man before him wasn't the cold, calculating charlatan who had manipulated his grief. He was something far worse, someone who had lost everything, even his mind. Ben Sarah's voice was soft, almost pleading as she touched his arm. Let's leave him. He's not worth it. Ben's jaw tightened as he continued to watch Cole. Every fiber of his being wanted to lash out, to demand some kind of justice for what Cole had done. But Sarah was right. There was nothing to be gained from tormenting a broken man. As if sensing Ben's eyes on him, Cole's gaze snapped up, locking onto him with a sudden intensity. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, seemed to burn with a manic fire. He staggered toward Ben, his hands outstretched, fingers clawing at the air like a desperate man reaching for salvation. They promised me power, Ben Cole rasped, his voice hoarse from his earlier screaming. The spirits, they promised, but they lied. They lied to me. His voice cracked, and his face contorted with fear. They're coming, Ben. They're coming for me. For all of us. Ben didn't move. He stood frozen as Cole's frantic words echoed in the early morning air. The fortune teller, once so composed and manipulative, was now utterly broken, consumed by the very darkness he had sought to control. But Ben knew better. The only spirits that had haunted Cole were the ones born from his own greed, his own deception, and now he was paying the price. "Leave him," Ben said quietly, his voice thick with exhaustion. "He's already lost." The crowd murmured in agreement. The power Cole once held over them had evaporated, leaving behind only the pitiful remnants of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Now he was a pariah shunned and abandoned by the very people who had once feared and revered him. Cole let out another ragged scream, this one more desperate than the last, as he collapsed to his knees. His hands clawed at the earth, dirt taking his fingers, as he muttered incoherently about vengeance, curses, and spirits that would come to claim them all. But the villagers no longer listened. They turned away, one by one, leaving Cole alone in the mist, his frantic cries fading into the distance. For a moment, Ben lingered, watching as Cole's figure grew smaller and smaller, consumed by the fog and his own madness. There was no satisfaction in seeing the man's downfall, only a hollow emptiness that gnawed at his insides. Sarah gently tugged at his arm. "Let's go home," she whispered, her voice soft and broken. "There's nothing left for us here." Ben nodded slowly, casting one last glance at the pitiful figure of Master Cole. The fortune teller's voice had grown faint, now little more than a whisper on the wind, rambling about spirits and revenge. As they walked away, Ben's mind raced, replaying everything that had led them to this moment, the lies, the manipulation, the false hope that had turned their grief into something darker. Master Cole had tried to wield the power of fear, but in the end he had been consumed by it. As the village returned to its routine, Cole's presence slowly faded from their minds. The once feared fortune teller became a ghost of his former self, wandering aimlessly outside the village, muttering to himself, his mind lost to the madness he had once claimed to control. Days passed, and Cole was rarely seen. When villagers caught glimpses of him, they quickly turned away, not out of fear, but out of disgust and pity. He had become a living embodiment of the very curses he had once fabricated, haunted not by spirits but by his own demons. One evening, weeks after that fateful night, a group of children, unaware of the full weight of Cole's fall from grace, found him near the edge of the forest, his frail form hunched over, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was muttering under his breath, his fingers digging into the earth as if trying to bury something only he could see. "They'll come for me soon," he whispered, his voice rasping and dry. "But they won't stop with me. They never stop." The children ran back to the village, their faces pale, but no one followed. Cole's fate had been sealed, and the village had moved on. He had become a forgotten, mad figure, once feared, now discarded, his words lost to the wind. The man who had sought to control the spirits now found himself haunted by them, or at least haunted by the guilt of what he had unleashed. And as the seasons passed, Master Cole, the great fortune teller of Thornton, faded into nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder that some forces, whether real or imagined, were never meant to be controlled. Part 9. A family's lasting pain. The village of Thornton slowly returned to its quiet, uneventful rhythm after the downfall of Master Cole. The eerie fog that had once blanketed the streets with superstition seemed to lift, but for Ben and Sarah, their personal storm raged on. The emptiness that Oliver had left behind was too vast to feel, too deep for any solace to reach. It hung over their home like a constant shadow, stretching through the corners of their modest cottage and filling the spaces where their son's laughter had once echoed. For days, they spoke very little, communicating only through the silence of shared grief. Ben often found himself standing by the river, staring out at the water that had claimed his son. He could almost see the ghostly shape of Oliver's body drifting beneath the surface, as if the river had never truly let him go. Sarah, meanwhile, spent hours sitting at the small wooden table by the window, her eyes vacant as she stared into the distance, lost in thoughts of what could have been. The village moved on, but for them, time had stopped. Their lives had once been simple, even after the war. Thornton had offered them a sense of peace, a place to rebuild. They had hoped it would be a safe haven, somewhere to raise their son away from the chaos, and destruction that Ben had foreseen. But now, the village felt like a graveyard. Every face reminded them of their loss, every stone of the quiet, unbearable truth that they would never see their boy again. Yet, despite the heavy weight that pressed down on them, Ben and Sarah tried to return to their lives. They tried to pick up the pieces, even though they no longer fit together in the way they once had. Ben resumed fishing, the nets feeling heavier in his hands without Oliver by his side. Sarah continued tending to the small garden outside their home, her fingers moving mechanically through the soil, but her mind elsewhere. They were going through the motions of living, but in their hearts they knew they would never fully recover. It was late one evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, that Sarah stood by the riverbank, staring out at the darkening waters. The sound of the rushing current was oddly soothing, though it had taken so much from them. She had come to this spot every night since Oliver's death, hoping that somehow he could feel her presence, that he would know his parents were still thinking of him, still aching for him. She reached into the basket by her feet and pulled out a small lantern, its soft, flickering light casting a faint glow on her pale face. For a moment she hesitated, clutching the lantern to her chest as tears welled up in her eyes. Then with a trembling hand she bent down and set it gently on the ground, right by the water's edge. Every night she and Ben had done this, lighting a lantern and leaving it by the riverbank, as if it might somehow guide Oliver's spirit back to them, or at the very least guide him to peace. It was a small ritual, a gesture that brought them a sliver of comfort in their grief. They knew it wouldn't change anything, but it was all they had left to offer their son. Sarah stood up, brushing a stray tear from her cheek, and turned to see Ben approaching from the cottage. His face was worn, lined with the kind of sorrow that never truly fades. In his eyes there was the same hollowness she saw in her own reflection, a depth of pain that words could never express. "They say it helps," Ben said softly, his voice thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. Sarah nodded, though they both knew that nothing could ever really help, not in the way they needed it to. But the lanterns had become a part of their nightly routine, a fragile thread that came connected to their son and to each other. Together, they stood in silence by the river, watching as the soft glow of the lantern flickered against the water. The breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, and for a brief moment, Sarah imagined that she could feel Oliver's presence. It wasn't the cold, hollow feeling of a ghost, but something warmer, gentler sense that maybe, just maybe, their son had found some peace after all. But the pain of his absence was always there, like a knife twisting in their hearts. It was a kind of pain that never truly leaves, no matter how much time passes. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the spaces where Oliver should have been at the table during dinner, in the yard where he used to play, in the sound of Ben's voice calling out to him, even though he knows there will never be an answer. They didn't speak of Master Cole anymore, nor of the dark ritual that had nearly torn them apart. The fortune teller had become little more than a bitter memory, a figure cast out by the village, wandering in madness and solitude. The spirits he had claimed to control had turned on him, and now he was as lost as the people he had once manipulated. But even with Cole gone, the damage he had done remained. Ben and Sarah carried it with them, heavy and suffocating, as they tried to move forward. The village, too, had changed. Though the fear and superstition had subsided, a quiet unease lingered in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the next tragedy to strike. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the villagers gradually stopped speaking of Oliver's death. Life went on, and people found new things to occupy their time. But for Ben and Sarah, the passage of time did little to dull the ache in their hearts. It only deepened the sense of loss, the realization that they would never again hear their son's laughter or see his bright smile. Each night, without fail, they lit a lantern and left it by the river, its flickering light a beacon for a spirit that might never return. They didn't know if it truly made a difference, but it gave them something to hold on to, something to believe in when everything else had been stripped away. On some nights, When the air was still and the moon hung low over the water, Ben would sit by the riverbank long after Sarah had gone inside. He would watch the lantern's flame, the way it danced in the gentle breeze, and he would talk to Oliver as if his son was still there, sitting beside him. "I'm sorry," Sonny would whisper, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "I couldn't save you. I tried. But I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't strong enough." The words always caught in his throat, choking him with the weight of his guilt. He knew that Oliver wouldn't blame him, but that didn't ease the pain. It didn't take away the sense that he had failed the one person who had meant everything to him. Some nights, Sarah would hear Ben's whispered apologies from the open window of their cottage, and she would cry silently into her pillow, her heart breaking all over again. She knew that Ben's guilt was as deep as her own, but there was nothing she could say to take it away. They were both trapped in their grief, prisoners of a loss they could never escape. And so, they continued with their nightly ritual, lighting a lantern and setting it by the river, hoping that somewhere, somehow, it would reach Oliver's spirit and guide him to peace. It was a small comfort, but it was all they had left. In time, the pain became a part of them, woven into the fabric of their lives. It didn't fade, but they learned to live with it, to carry it with them as they went about their days. The lanterns remained, their flickering light a testament to the love they still held for their son and to the hope that one day they might find peace as well. But even as the years passed and the village continued to grow and change around them, Ben and Sarah never forgot. They never stopped grieving for Oliver, and they never stopped leaving a lantern by the riverbank each night, a quiet, enduring symbol of the love they had lost and the hope that still lingered in their hearts. Perhaps one day they would find their own peace, but for now they would wait by the river, watching the light flicker in the darkness and whispering the name of the boy who had once been their world. Oliver,